a lot of other YouTubers are coping and seething right now. You know, Nintendo just announced a Nintendo Switch Direct, and everybody else is upset. Oh, no, the Nintendo Switch, it's over. This shouldn't get another Direct. We can't do this. Like, they're coping with it, you know? They're still trying to do this thing where they're just kind of like, well, of course they have to announce new games for the Switch, you know, so they can give it a proper send-off. This will be the final Nintendo Switch Direct ever. You know, completely unwilling to admit the reality of the situation. Something I've been talking about for a long time, and something that does need to be acknowledged in the community. Like, the mindset that people have that the Nintendo Switch will die immediately after the Nintendo Switch 2 gets announced has been demonstrably proven to be a complete misconception, right? It's amazing to me that the same group of people who will pretend that the PS2 somehow has sold like 5 million units 20 years later, overnight, how they'll also like turn around and say that like, oh no, nobody's gonna want older Nintendo hardware. You know, Nintendo can't keep selling this stuff, and it's not gonna stay on shelves, and people aren't gonna buy older Switch models. You know, like this idea that people have that Nintendo Switch 1 is just gonna fall off is just completely wrong. Right? This has been demonstrated. We all know it's true, right? Like, of course, the Switch 1 will be phased out eventually, but that's the word here, is like phased out. You know, like, it's not just going to be like, oh, the Switch 2 is out, time to stop all support, time to, like, shut off the online features, time to stop everything, like, immediately. That just isn't going to happen. And I've talked about this a lot, but this is, I think, the crux of, like, anti-Nintendo criticism right now, is this idea that everyone's excited for the new, exciting thing, and that there's nothing to look forward to on Nintendo consoles, you know, on Nintendo Switch, right? This has been the case for, like, since Animal Crossing New Horizons came out in 2020, right? Oh, the Switch 2 is coming out. Oh, we're gonna get all these... We're going to get a Switch upgrade, and nobody will want to play on the Switch anymore. You know, I don't want to play with you anymore. You know, no one's excited for games like No More Heroes 3, Bayonetta 3, Mario and Luigi Brothership, you know, Mario Wonder, Tears of the Kingdom, right? You know, I remember when Mario Wonder was announced in 2023, June of 2023, and people like Maximilian Dude were saying that was going to be the final Nintendo Switch Direct, right? You know? Like, does anybody else remember that? Like, at all? Like, people have been saying this for a long time, is that the Nintendo Switch is doomed, and yet it keeps going along. It stays very relevant, and it's still going to be used for a long time after a new piece of hardware releases. And a part of me thinks, like, at this stage, that the Nintendo Switch 2 isn't really a new piece of hardware, but an iterative upgrade, you know, along the same lines as the Game Boy Color or the new 3DS. Yes, there will be exclusive games for that piece of hardware, but by and large, it's still very much in line with what Nintendo did with the Switch. So that's kind of how I see it. You know, this is how I see the current state of things. Is that people really don't want to admit just how badly Nintendo is dominating the competition right now. You know, like, we're getting 2 directs back to back within a week of each other, right? We have so many games coming out that we have to have like over an hour long worth of presentations to go over them all, right? You're going to see Nintendo Switch 1 and Nintendo Switch 2 outperform the Steam Deck and every other of its competitors in the next, for the foreseeable future, right? 2 Nintendo consoles are going to outperform the competition, right? You're going to see situations like the Mario movie and the Zelda movie outperform most Hollywood blockbusters, right? like, again, you still don't really see a lot of people acknowledge just how much better the Mario movie was than every Marvel film ever made. People will soy jack about like Marvel, Star Wars, Warhammer 40K, whatever, like, Western slop gets like shoved down their like fat gullets. But they'll turn around and try to say that like Nintendo is like too childish, right? That's been the go-to Coke, while they're hyped about the next Cape Shit movie, right? The double standard is very real. When it comes to this fear and like when it comes to the way these games are evaluated and viewed. And I have to wonder, like, if when all of like the negative copes about Nintendo are all just gonna fall apart, like the old go-to like justification, like, oh, I just don't want to play that, like when it comes to like everything they put out, like more and more we're seeing like a lot of these narratives fall apart. Fire Emblem blew up in popularity. Xenoblade is on top of the world right now. Zelda's more popular than ever. It's very, very difficult for me to believe that anyone who's seriously interested in video games wouldn't find something to enjoy and play on Nintendo Switch, right? To me, the way it looks like when it comes to like the online gaming space is that like people actively are searching for like sponsorship deals and want Ubisoft or whoever to pay them to show like slop that like has to do well. Stuff like Assassin's Creed Shadows, right? We've seen this over the past couple of weeks where like every major gaming YouTuber, well, not even like even major, like, every gaming YouTuber, every career gaming YouTuber has been like releasing statements about how like Assassin's Creed Shadows is actually really good and it's really gorgeous and like it's just so much fun to play. And then you see like the reality of it, of like Yasuke the Black Samurai like just crawling under like the attacks of like evil Nipponese Japanese samurai, like like real samurai, uh like you see like just how bad the AI is, how bad the animation is, just how bad the combat is, right? Like you see how bad Assassin's Creed Shadows actually is just by like looking at it, you know in a lot of ways, like I feel like Ghost of Tsushima was the last time that like anybody will be able to like gaslight anybody about like gamers about like the quality of their products, because Ghost of Tsushima was a really interesting title because that was the game that like the corporate YouTubers tried to prop up, as being like better than The Last of Us Part Two, when in reality it was just as woke, just as compromised, made by the same kind of people, and that fact has become more evident with now that we've seen like more of the sequel, right? This is the typical woke mindset. Netflix series, it takes 3 episodes for like the woke to really make itself evident, because they have to like make you think that like the show is going to be good, that you want to stay interested and engage with it, and then like they just hit you over the head with it by episode 3, right? We saw this with like Daredevil, Born Again. We saw this with like shows like The Boys, Invincible, right? Like all of them are bad, okay? And with video games, I find it interesting. A lot of critics right now, like the big cope with Switch 2, like, oh, is it gonna be woke? First of all, it's a video game console, and second of all, they wouldn't wait for a new console release to make their brand woke. If anything, I've become like convinced over the past like year or so that like Nintendo's pretty staunchly anti-woke. After like some of the things they did with Tears of the Kingdom and with like Fire Emblem Engage and like Xenoblade Chronicles X, like I'm pretty convinced, Brothership especially. I'm pretty convinced the company is like pretty firmly anti-woke, but like you're not going to see me brag about that a lot. Like, you're not going to see me address it because that would just make them a target by woke activists. So, like, to me, I find it interesting how the narrative has always been that Nintendo's failing, they're on the way out, that they aren't succeeding, that like they can't maintain this momentum, and yet like they keep dominating. One of the examples of this that I do think needs to be talked about more is just like the whole RPG thing, because that was the big cope back in the 90s. Like, well, PlayStation has all of the biggest RPGs. Like, that was the big defining cope of that generation. It was that like, well, like if you want RPGs, you have to go to PlayStation. And meanwhile, Nintendo had just established the biggest RPG franchise ever in Pokemon on the Game Boy, right? Nintendo won that console generation, absolutely. But yet you still have this like gigantic cope of people who don't understand the context of what was happening. PlayStation propagandizing the entire gamer world against Nintendo. Sony was able to expand to regions that Nintendo didn't have a foothold in yet. PlayStation paid third parties to not support the console. When you understand the full context of what happened in the 90s, it's undeniable that Nintendo won the console war then. But instead, we had to do this like song and dance where we just pretended that like gaming handhelds don't matter, that Pokemon doesn't matter, that like nothing Nintendo does matter, that like somehow establishing like the most recognizable characters in gaming didn't matter, right? And now, in the wake of like a $1 billion movie, it's becoming apparent just how important that actually was. Seeing how like, serious things that were seen as like serious competition for Nintendo back in the 90s, Sonic the Hedgehog, Croc, like Crash Bandicoot, like seeing how all of that has like fallen off and become irrelevant, right? Like, I think people really, really underestimate just how badly Nintendo has won the console war, right? There just is no hope of recovery for PlayStation, Xbox, or PC. The copes people have about it, like, oh, gotcha, mobile games will save us from Nintendo. Like, mobile games are like subsidized entirely by whales, okay? Like, whales who only put as much money as they do into it because of like, they just have disposable income, right? Like, it doesn't have anything to do with like the games being fun or interesting or memorable. It's just like, oh yeah, I'll put like $5 in today to get this screen to load up faster, right? Like, that's their mindset. That's how people approach mobile games. Like, that cannot compete with Nintendo on like an enthusiast level, right? When it comes to like, players of all skill levels, Nintendo is clearly dominant in this sphere, and there is just this very strong unwillingness to acknowledge it. And I do think, like, now that we can like see that Nintendo has 2 Nintendo Directs in the pipeline, we are going to see just an insane amount of fresh original content that will never be available on Xbox, PlayStation, or PC that will just clearly demonstrate just how much better Nintendo is than the competition.